Okay, Dad, today is Monday, May 6th, and what should we talk about today?
Well, I think we'll focus on Ukraine today. Um,
You
but
sure?
before we get to it, there's just I came across a poll that I found very interesting. I think we were in a previous podcast. We're wondering, or you may have asked me about Jewish support, for Israel
Mm, within the United
within
States.
the United States, correct? And I didn't have those figures at the time, but I came across a very interesting poll just a couple days ago. This is actually specifically about the protests. You could say the anti-Israel protests, or pro-Palestinian protests on university campuses in the U.S. And we see a lot of the same patterns that we've seen in other polls. It's not surprising that older people tend to be against the protests. There's much more support for them among younger people. And then we see the same, split between Republican leaning voters and Democrat leaning voters. Overall, there's actually fairly strong support for
Israel.
actually not for for Israel, for the crackdown on the protests. So you have 47% of all Americans opposed to the pro-Palestinian college protests,
Mm,
and only what something like 30%, 28% support them.
okay.
Yeah. So it's actually, actually had more sympathy for the Palestinians in general than for these protests. There
Mm.
seems to be more, hostility within the population towards
Why do you
college
think? Why do you think
protesters.
that is?
Well, I think it's some of the things that we've talked about earlier. Just sort of
Right.
like there's a lot of people are annoyed at, college students and in general, and just don't not like the idea of protests. So it just may be not so much particularly what these protests are about, but just sort of a general sentiment against, university campus protests. I think that's
Right.
part of what's going on here. But the interesting thing about this poll is that they broke it out according to religious identification. So they break it down according to Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, atheists, and Jews, and so we can see what actually what American Jews as a group, how they view these protests. And what you find is actually, there were two questions that were asked. Okay, one was, do Americans support? Okay, do you support or oppose recent pro-Palestinian college protests? And the other is, have the college's responses to the pro-Palestinian campus protests been too harsh or not harsh enough?
Who did this poll? Who did this
It's called
poll?
YouGov.
Okay, so it's a government poll. It's a kind of a standard.
Yeah,
Poll.
I don't know that it's actually run by the government. I'm not actually sure exactly what, but it is, it's a well-known polling agency, and they've been around for a long time.
Mm,
But anyway, what they've found is that, for in the responses to both these questions, the one group, we have age groups, we have, the the respondents are broken out by age, political party affiliation, and also religious identification. And then, so there are several categories. For the one category in both cases that is most strongly opposed to the protests is, in fact, Jews. So it's like, for the first question, do you support or oppose the protests? You get 18% of Jews support them, but 72% oppose them.
mm,
And then on the crackdown question, you get about the same amount of support, or enough. Again, it's what 14% feel that the crackdown has been too harsh, but you get 59% that say that it's not harsh enough, and that's by far the strongest.
right.
Yeah,
So
so it seems that it's clear that obviously there is dissent within the Jewish community, and it's significant, but it's a very much a minority.
right,
Yeah,
over
a
over eighty
strong
percent of Jews seem to be fully supportive of the Zionist regime based on these polls.
Yeah, and it certainly seems to be the case.
And
Yeah.
were you able to stratify it by age? Can we say how many young Jews?
No, they didn't break it out. I mean, there's a separate question about Jews. Actually, I mean, not Jews, but rather age.
Mm,
And so it's broken out, I think, between like 44 and below and 45 and above. And then you find there what pretty much you'd expect. There's,
Mm.
against the older folks tend to be less sympathetic to Palestinians,
Right.
and more
Yeah, I'd be
sympathetic to
curious to
Israel.
see what like the 18 to 25-year-old cohort,
Right. That
like if that's split 50-50 or even possibly even more,
Right.
18 to Jews that are between the ages of 18 and 25
Right.
are against the state of Israel, because that just shows you the winds of change are coming. That's the true
right.
change in
Yeah. So
trajectory.
it may in fact be that, right. That like again, the support for Israel is rock solid, in the 30 or 35 and above age group among Jews, and it may approach, 90% or more, but then there's a real dramatic shift within young Jews. Now, we don't know from this, but we can suspect that.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point there we'll find a poll that,
Yeah, maybe we'll get the numbers on
Right.
that. Well, it might change even more. I mean, this situation is evolving so quickly. I don't know if you even saw, but just basically right before you arrived for the podcast, I was just on Twitter and I saw Rafah trending, 1.5 million tweets about Rafah. Looks like the Rafah invasion is happening. Have you seen anything about that yet? Probably not, because you're driving over
that's
here.
Right. No, I haven't. I mean, there were certainly signs that it was imminent. And it never stopped entirely. I mean, there had been strikes on Rafah, and I think increasing in the last few
I'm
days.
I'm not even sure if a full invasion has started. I've just been seeing videos of some pretty big explosions, and in the city,
Right.
big bomb dust clouds popping up. So it seems like something's going on, and I guess they've been dropping leaflets all over Rafah saying for the citizens to evacuate immediately.
Right.
But they don't really have anywhere to go. They
Right.
just go into the desert without any water and die there, I guess.
Right.
So-
And also they know from experience, it's just that, they're often told that there's a safe zone here or there, and they enter the safe zone, so-called safe zone, and they get shot. So it happens again and again.
Yeah, and they always also, blame the Palestinians, blame Hamas for refusing to agree to a ceasefire. But
Not the Palestinians, you mean the Israelis.
the Israelis keep on accusing the Palestinians of refusing to agree to some type of ceasefire. But people need to understand that the conditions for the ceasefire is a temporary ceasefire to say release all the hostages.
Right.
And then the IDF gets a vacation for 4 to 6 weeks, and then they come back and then continue the genocide. There's no real change.
Right. Because they say like about the only bargaining chip they have, is the hostages. And right. So they're being asked to give up the only bargaining chip they have, and then with no protection.
Right. They don't.
Future destruction.
Right. It's all when we talk about the ceasefire, we're talking about, just delaying the inevitable. The blockade still continues, and the inevitable invasion of Rafah and the destruction of Gaza is coming. So it's not a great deal. It's like, would you rather die now or die in 2 months? Is kind of what's being presented. Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot of talk about Rafah on the next podcast. But you were saying you want to talk about Ukraine as well. Some interesting developments.
Okay. Well,
wait. Let me
Sure.
see if I remember, if I can guess what you're going to say.
All right.
I just heard that Macron is sent French Foreign Legion troops to Ukraine, and is talking. And there's more talk about actually putting boots on the ground, and this sort of this escalation with NATO kind of potentially getting actually involved directly into the conflict.
Right. We have to still say that these are rumors. I mean,
I heard seven French Foreign Legion soldiers were killed. I don't know if it's been verified. But
right. Actually, I heard. Okay, that I hadn't heard. I mean, there was some rumor going around a couple of weeks ago that a number of French soldiers were killed in an attack, but then I never heard anything more about it. So that's definitely wasn't confirmed. I think a lot of the fuss right now is that, there was recently a couple articles came out by a former U.S. government employee. He was in, somewhere used to be part of the blob, the security complex in the U.S. government, and fairly high up in it, as I understand. Stephen Bryan, he wrote a couple articles, and one of them made this claim. He apparently has his sources within the government and probably the security agencies that that Macron had sent French foreign legionnaires to Ukraine, something like 100, but with the plans to send more. And they're described as advisors, but he put his advisors in quotation marks. And he pointed out that at the early stages of the Vietnam War, the U.S. sent advisors, which actually were not advisors. That was for public consumption. That's what American citizens were told, but it turned out they were actually special forces. And yeah, according to Stephen Bryan, they were actually not sent, to Western Ukraine, far from the front lines, but to Slavyansk, which is very close, to the fighting. Now, again, that just hasn't been confirmed. And in fact, the Russian government addressed it and says that, we don't have that information, but we're looking into it.
Mm.
So we don't know.
Yeah, they summoned a bunch of Western ambassadors. Russia did in Moscow. They summoned them to talk about this, I think, about the involvement of the UK and France.
Well, this, I think, was specifically the UK because...
long-range missiles, right?
Right. It was the foreign minister, Cameron, formerly David Cameron, formerly the prime minister.
Is it Cameron?
Yeah.
Everyone's in there, you say Cameron. No one says Cameron,
okay.
right?
Well, I'm sorry. Okay, Cameron. Okay, Cameron. Okay, yeah. But he, recently said that, I don't know if it was in response to a reporter's question or something, but he said publicly that yes, that Britain was sending, missiles or weapons to Ukraine that could be used against Russia directly, and fired into Russian territory. And, we're not talking about, territory that was formerly Ukrainian, and therefore, at least disputed, but actual,
right. We're not talking
Russian
about
territory.
Donetsk, not talking about Crimea,
Right.
talking about striking into
Belgorod
region or
right.
something like this.
So,
into
yeah,
actual
right.
proper Russia.
Now, I remember he made that statement. It raised a lot of eyebrows, and then he kind of walked it back. But I think just recently, the British Spattis was called in, and the Russians stated explicitly, if you do that, we will strike British assets in Ukraine or elsewhere. Meaning this is an act of war against Russia by Britain. It would be if you did that.
So Russia's drawing a firm red line here,
Right.
saying,
no ambiguity.
Okay, so you think that if Ukraine uses these long range missiles and uses them and strikes into Belgorod, what do you think Russia would actually go after UK directly, or just focus on UK assets in Ukraine?
I think that's what they would go to first.
Which is what they're kind of doing already, right?
Right.
So
I don't know if they have been going after UK assets in particular. They definitely have struck the French.
Everybody likes striking.
Yeah, right. That's a part of the reason that maybe one of the reasons that Macron's going crazy and making all these threats now, that he was really enraged by the strike on French mercenaries.
It's kind of interesting because it seems like the way Russia's dealing with it feels like they're not dealing with NATO directly. Uh-huh. NATO isn't this unified bloc. They're kind of dealing with individual countries and how they're responding. Uh-huh. Because the U.S. is obviously the big potato, but Biden's asleep at the wheel. I don't know what's going on there. But Macron is doing his own thing, saying we got to send troops to Odessa. It looks like he's already sent some troops. Right. Germany says, "This no way, Jose. We're not getting involved in this. Don't do it." The UK is kind of saying we won't send troops, but we'll keep on sending munitions with longer range, and you guys do what you want with it. So it seems like we don't have a unified response from NATO. It's just I think that's a sign that there's a lot of infighting and confusion within NATO. People don't really know how to handle the situation.
Right. Well, certainly the great majority of European countries have taken issue with Macron's plans. In particular the Germans. Only the Baltic states and Poland have shown, responded positively.
Well, not all the Baltic states, right? Or all of them?
I think.
Estonia, Lithuania. I got confused for a second with the Balkans. I was like, Serbia, the Baltic states. We're talking about, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing just sort of a slow escalation happening here? It feels like that's kind of how we've been dealing with this war the past 2 years. Yeah, we kind of keep on putting toes across lines.
Right. Well, it certainly has been an escalation over the years. A lot of weapon systems that were rolled out, are now were later sent to Ukraine. And the thing is, the fact is, again, that these have failed. Each one of these, these escalations have failed to bring about the desired result, which of course is, inflicting defeat on Russia. So, the final escalation is direct, NATO involvement, or at least NATO member state involvement. And now that's obviously being kicked around. We don't know if it's really happening, if it ever will.
It's weird because it's like kind of happening. They're dipping their
Well,
toes into
yeah,
the pool, right?
right.
I mean, we said all. I mean, most of these NATO countries have advisors.
Yeah, right.
In
And
there.
that's been true for a long time. I think it's been true pretty much since the beginning. So it's not so much an escalation.
But the
I
French
mean,
Foreign Legion is actually
okay,
more
if
of a
if the French Foreign Legion, because this is like again what Stephen Bryan said, it wasn't, they weren't, what do they call it, sheep dipped. Okay, well that means that you take forces that were part of your formal military structure. You take them out of uniform. You give them an honorable discharge, and then you send them to Ukraine. And actually, so they're not officially your people. You create this deniability.
right. So that way they're kind of freelance mercenaries, but they were honorably discharged by the government to become these.
Right. So I think that was true, for example, of the 60 French personnel that were killed in the missile strike a couple months ago. Okay, so they weren't actually, officially French soldiers, but everybody officially, no, they were sheep dipped, as we're saying. But what if this rumor, this most recent rumor, this report from Stephen Bryan is true? The French Foreign Legion troops that were sent there recently weren't ship dipped. They were just, they were dipped. Yeah, they are there. If in fact they are there, if they are there, they are there as French Foreign Legionnaires.
What is the response from the rest of the Western world? Like, I mean, the rest of NATO. I mean,
well, in general, actually, the U.S. has said, that they oppose the idea.
Do you think we really do?
Well, okay. Well, this is an interesting thing. Again, this Stephen Bryan wrote a second article. It was about the U.S. And he said the plan is, Biden wants to send U.S. troops, according to him. Now, maybe this is all bogus, or maybe it's just, it's being put out there just to worry the Russians or something. Who knows? But if it is, but what he reported was that, again, that Biden is planning to send troops, but he knows that it's a very unpopular thing to do. So he's waiting for the election in the fall, and he hopes that he'll be reelected and then send troops. Or maybe even if he's not reelected, he'll send troops, and then, Trump will be stuck with it.
Yeah, I mean,
because this is something, again, you can look to Vietnam. It was Johnson, at the beginning, in the early years of the Vietnam War, when the so-called advisors were sent and so on, he kept on swearing up and down, we're not going to send U.S. troops. We're not going to send them. Then he was reelected in a landslide in 1964. And after that, he started sending troops.
Yeah, I just feel like, we've seen this before with Biden, his inability to draw red lines, and even if he doesn't want to send troops over, it doesn't seem like he's really in charge or capable of drawing a red line and reinforcing it. We've seen this with Benjamin Netanyahu. He could have easily just said, we'll cut off munitions.
Just say no, right?
Just say no, right? If you invade Rafah, we'll say no. We don't want a humanitarian crisis on our hand. This has to stop. He could just do that, but he won't do it. He just
well, again, it's Israel. He can't do it.
Right.
He doesn't think he can.
But even with like the strike against, we talked about this, the escalation with Iran, how this just draw a red line, condemn the attack on the Iranian embassy. Doing something like this to show. But it seems like we're hearing just sort of general platitudes from the White House when it comes to the French sending troops into Ukraine, but there are no red lines, which kind of makes me feel like, just like he was with Netanyahu, like, okay, we'll say some things, but you go ahead and do what you want to do.
Right.
And it sounds like he almost, because if he doesn't want to escalate towards World War III, just say no. Just tell him no, and make it clear what the U.S. position is that we're not sending troops to Ukraine. Yeah. But the fact that he's not able to do that makes me feel like he almost wants to use Macron as a potential tripwire to draw in the other NATO countries and the United States and everybody. Because let's be honest, this Ukraine project has been an obsession for Biden for 25 years? He's been working on this for a long, long time. He's been a neocon, Cold War warrior. He was got his son on Burisma and helped orchestrate the whole Maidan coup. while he was vice president. His fingerprints all over this project.
Uh,
Um,
yeah. Well.
I don't
Yeah.
think he can just let it go.
Yeah. Well, I think again, originally he said, "Oh no, we're not sending tanks. We're not going to do that." And I think probably he actually meant that because he very foolishly, like a lot of people in the U.S. government, simply assumed that Russia was a house of cards. They're still thinking about Russia of the 1990s, the Russia that could kick around, the Russia that could barely hold itself together. But then they found out it was not true. This is really much to their shock. The economic sanctions failed, and now the various military packages, the so-called wonder weapons, they've all failed, to achieve the hoped for results. So either you just walk away from it and say, okay, yeah, we made a big mistake, or you double down. And in this case, though, this is, doubling down really does put us at a risk for World War III. I mean, we're just kind of coming up to the threshold, and this sending, NATO, not necessarily NATO troops, but again, NATO member state troops into Ukraine really puts us, creates a very dangerous situation. So you just hope, that, well, okay, this time you say, you realize you just can't take this step. That's all you can hope for. But again,
I've been hearing rumors that the U.S. is looking at throwing Zelensky under the bus. Have you heard that?
Not recently. I mean, earlier there was a lot of talk about that. It was thought that actually maybe Zelensky was their man, and they were backing him. I think perhaps, who knows what was really going on? Perhaps, Zelensky just outmaneuvered them, or there were just different factions within the U.S. government. Actually, right. This happens too.
I heard Zelensky is becoming just so unpopular, and also, the elections in Ukraine. This is we keep on saying how we have to fight for this Ukrainian democracy, even though we overthrew their duly elected president, right, and a democratically elected president, right, in 2014, installed a puppet. And now Zelensky has suspended all elections.
Prior to that, even before the war, he was shutting down opposition parties and
right, so shutting down media that's not favorable to him. And,
right.
So the idea it's a democracy is silly. But the election for Ukraine was supposed to have happened, and the new president is supposed to come in power on the 20th of May. Of course, there are no elections, but I heard that. We'll see what happens, but I've been hearing that the State Department is thinking about we need to change and potentially put somebody in like Poroshenko in power. Obviously, this is not an easy maneuver. Zelensky's not wanting to go, so just a sign of more chaos.
Clearly there's a lot of instability. In Ukraine, we've talked about the recent mutinies, on the front line. The different brigades that have refused orders,
including like
orders.
the Azov brigades,
right,
the 32nd Assault Group or whatever.
Right, I think the 3rd Assault Brigade, and then there's I think the 47th or something that's associated with the right sector. These were very close to Zelensky, and there are other brigades as well, but. You stop and think about it. I mean, ever since, I think it's coincidence more than anything else, but ever since Zelensky was removed from, his position as the supreme commander of armed forces in Ukraine and replaced with Syrskyi, things have gone particularly bad. It was not long afterwards that Avdiivka fell. And then when Avdiivka fell...
just a demoralizing thing for the troops, right?
I think Avdiivka was going to fall anyway.
Right.
But now it's... I'm sure it was. But, that's going to... There was a lot of unhappiness about the selection of Syrskyi. He's got the nickname of Butcher.
Right. And the Butcher of Bakhmut. I was going to bring that up.
And it's not because he kills, Russians but rather he sacrifices the lives of his own men.
Right, he's a meat grinder tactic guy.
Yeah,
I mean that's what we saw, with Bakhmut. That's where he first gained that nickname, right? Because they kept on sending troops into Bakhmut, trying to retake it, and then they did retake it, lose it, but they just lost a huge number of forces during that. That attempt to retake that city. for nothing.
Well, yeah. So, right, they achieved nothing. They lost in the end, and in the course sacrificed many thousands, I'm sure tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops. But yeah, and now, so he was already unpopular. Now, but you think about it, since the time that he's, assumed this new position as at the head of the armed forces in Ukraine, things have gone from bad to worse. The fall of Avdiivka, and then just one village, and after another. Since then, once they broke through, the Russians have really accelerated their advances. And I was just thinking the other day, it used to be that, well, I knew like the name of every village that was being fought over, because it might have been just one or two villages,
and they talk about it for a couple months.
Yeah, it might go on for weeks or months, right? And then eventually it would always fall to the Russians, but it might take a long time. But now, it's just they're spreading out. They attack a village, and they take it within a few days, and then they spread out from there to other villages, and I just can't keep up.
Yeah,
with
I know exactly what you mean.
So it's like, what? Okay, such and such just fell. I said, I don't know where that is.
I just got used to the village of Ocheretino, and now that one's already gone, and Kupiansk or whatever. I'm also having the same issue. I'm like, what the hell is this city? This town?
Right. So anyway, this has all happened on Syrski's watch, and of course, Syrsky was appointed by Zelensky. So I think that there's a lot of anger. I'm sure there's a lot of anger. It's clear there is a lot of unhappiness in the among the troops, and it's being directed at Syrsky and by association to Zelensky. So they're at risk.
Well, also this mobilization bill passed by Zelensky is very unpopular. I've been seeing a lot of videos of where they try to round up men. And then the local population, old babushkas, ladies, come out and start beating up the, trying to don't take this boy, and stop. You can see everybody's resisting.
Right. So it's bad. I mean, even if they succeed in wrestling these guys and, throwing them into the van, what kind of soldiers are they going to be on the front? You have a whole, entire platoons and battalions that are made up of people who don't want to be there.
Right. You don't want to be here. I don't want to be here either. Let's
exactly. Right.
Wave the white flag and get out of here, huh?
Yeah. So anyway, that's happening. Obviously there's a increasing risk of some kind of coup, increasing instability, and obvious loss of morale on the Ukrainian side. But then, what you were just describing, or we were talking about, this kind of multi-pronged attack that the Russians are carrying out after they captured Ocheretino. It actually has a military term. It's called a bloom. It's just that normally, or when you have a, let's say,
it's like a hub, right? A hub?
Well, not a hub. No, it's a bloom. So what it is, if you have an intact line of fortifications, actually, the defense will know where you have to attack. Essentially, I mean, because to get through, you got to take this piece out, and so they can prepare. They can bring in their reinforcements. They've got their artillery, and they're there waiting for you. But once you finally punch through that line of fortifications, then you get out into what they call operational space. And it means that you're here, you're on the other side, you've broken through, and they don't know which way you're going to go. And they haven't set up, a second line of fortifications. You can strike in whatever direction you want to, or in several different directions.
So that's what's happening.
And that's what's happening. And they just can't, they don't have the troops, they can't prepare. They don't know which way you're going to go. So they can't, say, okay, we'll get this, this battalion or this brigade right here. They're constantly guessing, and they can guess wrong. And then, so that's exactly what we're seeing. You call it a bloom. It's just like a flower, because they especially right there at Ocheretino is where it's most obviously happening. After they took that town, they began going east, west, north, southwest.
So is it fair to say that the line has collapsed?
Well, at that point, I think, it is fair to say it. And it's just in general after Avdiivka, maybe collapse. You could say, okay, we've again, this has been a war of attrition.
Yeah, I understand, right? But we can say the line has been severed.
It's been broken now, right? And in very important places.
So we got roses blooming on multiple spots now.
The big one was Avdiivka. Okay, that was the mother of all fortresses, and a lot of people said it was like the most fortified city or place in the world. And I think they just didn't think the Russians would ever get through there because they didn't build a second line of fortifications. And then once they got through, there were these secondary kind of fortifications, also very important, but key points in their line of fortifications, like Ocheretino or Krasnogorovka, which are now are in the process of taking. There's a huge battle going on there, but I think it's like 75%, 80% under Russian control. From what I understand, they've taken all the key points, the factories, the high rises, and it's the Ukrainians are not going to be able to hang on very long. So that's another one of those very important fortified points. Another one they took recently was Nikola Maikova. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but
it's okay. Nobody knows what you're talking about.
But anyway, they've taken, after they took the big one, they're taking the secondary ones, and then each time they break through, you have the potential at least for a bloom again. Where they can just go off in different directions, and
there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, pretty much. There's just the Ukrainians are at a big disadvantage. They don't have their bunkers and their trenches, and they don't know which way you're going to go. And
do they end up coming behind and attacking the line from the rear in different places to create more blooms?
Yeah, well, we may start seeing that.
Or are they just
like in the case, they certainly are outflanking for whatever reason, we haven't seen encirclements. Well, we did early on with Mariupol, but in general, after the line really became more or less static, we just didn't see that. Like in Bakhmut, there was some outflanking maneuver, but they never entirely encircled the town. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think it's very difficult to do in this.
Do you think, we talked before about the possibility of a Kharkov invasion? We said that looked imminent. Do you think that's still in the works, or do you think that they're kind of, now that they've broken through these lines, maybe they don't really necessarily need to sort of take it? It can kind of just fall on its own. Like you said, it could be political. The population in Kharkov is mostly pro-Russian. Whoever is currently living there, it's kind of like a Vichy France type of thing. Would that be kind of what we'd say? Like they have their kind of puppet, but he may not really want to stay.
Well, I think, whoever they put in charge is probably very loyal to the government, but the population is sympathetic to Russia, and certainly the population that hasn't evacuated.
Right.
I think everybody knows that. Well, there are kind of two different schools of thought about what's happening in Kharkov. One is that, an invasion is imminent. The Russians are going to strike from the north. They have something called the N group, which really means the North group. And just over the border in Belgorod. And it's some tens of thousands of soldiers. I've heard 100,000. I've heard less. I'm not sure exactly what the number is. Maybe nobody.
Are there knows, fortifications around the city? How does this even work?
I don't think there really is.
So they just walk into the city? Is that what basically?
Well, the city's still a pretty good distance from the border, so they.
I know. I could drive into the city.
Yeah, right. We'll see. See what kind of. Maybe the Ukrainians just won't put up much of a fight. There actually been comments, from even suggestions by the Ukrainian government saying, you just get out, we're going to lose Kharkov.
Yeah.
So they may not put up much of a fight there. Okay. So there are two thoughts. Either the Russians are going to go in and actually try to take all of Kharkov, or maybe at this time, they're just making the Ukrainians think that and forcing them just to put a lot of troops up on the border there.
While they continue breaking through the line and other places.
So it could be one of the, of course, if they actually do move into Kharkov, then the Ukrainians will, if they're going to try to stop the Russian advances, they're going to be forced to send even more troops, which just weakens their lines farther south. That's what we talked about. That's, how most likely, if there is going to be a general offensive, it's not going to be concentrated in just one or two areas, but it's going to be along the entire line.
Push the whole front.
And if they extend the line, up into Kharkov in the north there, that weakens the line in the south because it just reduces they've got only a limited number of troops and equipment. And if the line becomes longer, they got to stretch that, those troops and equipment even thinner across the line.
Did you think it's fair to say that we're in the end game now in Ukraine?
Yeah, we seem to be approaching it. I mean, again, we're seeing things that we never saw before. We just mentioned, like, I can't, I don't even recognize the names of half of these towns now that, that they've taken or are in the process of taking. The
Do
Russians
you
are.
feel like that the Western countries realize that we're in
Well,
the end
yeah.
game?
Well, that's why we're probably getting all this talk about foreign troops.
That's
Why
what I was
would they
about
be
to say.
exactly?
Exactly.
Why would they be talking about it if they weren't scared?
That's what I was going to say. It
Right.
sounds like they realize they're
Right.
in the end game, and they don't want to, they don't want to lose. They're going to flip over the chessboard. Instead, they're going to try to sneak some more chess pieces onto the board by
Yeah.
using their own troops,
Yeah. Or
potentially.
at least they're going to try to convince the Russians that they're going to do that or something. Who knows?
But the Russians aren't going to be back down. They're not
No,
gonna
no,
be
no. I
scared,
think
so.
right.
So okay, then I'll just ask you directly. Do you think that there will be an actual deployment of real troops, like a real force, or is this all just bluster and we're coming to the end and we're going to reach negotiate settlement, or will the West really try to double down and force this war to continue by sending in NATO
Yeah.
forces into
You know,
Ukraine?
maybe I'm just putting too much faith in the sanity and intelligence of Western leaders, but I think that they're going to stop short of that. I don't say that with any confidence because again, these people just are clearly don't have a really firm grip on reality. I'm talking about Macron and Biden and the rest of them.
Sunak.
Yes, the it just seems like, well, first of all, it really does risk World War III. Do you really want to do that? I mean, they've been escalating, but now, this is the final escalation. This is the moment of truth where, either the Russians back down or they start killing your troops, and then what happens, right?
Right.
It just I would at least hope that they have enough sanity not to do that. And then the other thing is that it's clearly quite unpopular. I know in France, I don't know what the exact percentages were, but recent polls showed that the electorate in France is very strongly opposed to the idea.
Right.
And then in recent elections, I think it was for the European Parliament, Le Pen's party did very, very well. It's like just trounced Macron's party. It wasn't even close. And I don't know that that's all because
When's the next election in France? I know
it's a ways off yet. I think
it's every 5 years.
Yeah, I think we
longer.
may another couple of years. Yeah, but anyway, it shows there's a groundswell of opposition to this, and it's very unpopular in the United States. The idea of doing this. I mean, even the idea of sending the material and the money to Ukraine was unpopular.
Right.
Like the Republicans basically went against. Well, not all Republicans. Again, more than half of them voted against it. But it's very, among Republican voters and among voters overall, it's unpopular. It wasn't a popular, bill. It's just something that the elites in this country love. If they risk World War III, and then they also risk, getting voted out of office. So, I mean, it seems like if these guys just don't have enough, they can't really understand the risks that they're running. They're political animals. You think that they would understand that, I'm going to be kicked out of office if I do this. So I'm just thinking that they're not going to, but I may be wrong.
I think you're right, but maybe this is what they're thinking is that they have all these Western countries, the leaders are in big trouble. Everything has been going wrong with them with this war in Ukraine and Western Europe, energy prices, the war hasn't been going well. On top of that, you have the genocide in Gaza, which people are very upset about in France and Ukraine. I heard that the protests on French campuses are even worse than they are here on U.S.
probably.
Campuses.
Right.
And you can see, I have a friend in London. He said, these protests are massive.
Right.
In Germany.
Actually, right. I think the pro-Palestinian sentiment's definitely stronger in Europe than it is.
I think and we've talked about before how so many of these leaders are in low double digits.
Right.
Schultz and Macron, Sunak. Everybody's unpopular. So
maybe
Biden too, right? So everybody realizes they have a mess on their hand. Everybody realizes things aren't good. Nobody wants a war on their doorstep. And then you see what's happening in Gaza as well. So maybe their calculation is like, well, I'm damned either way right now. The only way I can get out of this and be reelected is I have to deliver decisive victory. And I can be Charles de Gaulle. I'm Macron. I can do
Right.
this. And
Yeah.
that maybe, that's what happens when people get desperate. Like have you ever been, doing betting and you're already down in the hole and you're like, just this last time,
Right.
I'm going to put it all on red and we're going to go for it. It's
Yeah.
that might be.
In Macron's case, it may be true. I don't. The others seem to be just to be a little bit more cautious and timid creatures. People like Olaf Scholz,
Yeah. Well,
but
maybe if Macron goes first, then they feel like
yeah. Well, that's what Macron. I think. Yeah, you may be right. He's thinking that it's my chance to beat De Gaulle or even Napoleon or something. The fact is that.
Do you think he's acting in this way so much because Candace Owens accused his wife of being a man?
Well, who knows?
maybe make me go crazy.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Start invading
well,
Russia.
He's an odd character. I mean, he always has been. It's just he'll say very interesting things. This has been going on for years, and it gets people like in the dissident community, whether it's on the right or the left, very excited because he's actually said something that you're not supposed to say if you're a part of the establishment. But he really, he goes out there and speaks the truth, that some forbidden truth, and people get quite excited, but he never follows through on it. That's what I've seen again and again over the years. So
yeah, that's just being French.
You think so? Okay. No. So yeah, I don't know what he's doing now. It may be the same thing. It's a lot of talk and it's going to be no action. But I think everybody agrees that he's very vain. And he really probably does like the idea of going, becoming the next de Gaulle, if not Napoleon. And now he's again, it's kind of silly because the French army is rather pathetic. It just couldn't really contribute to.
Is it because they're French, or is it the army being kind of pathetic?
No, yeah. Well, I'm just looking at the numbers.
I'm
not talking about the character of the men.
Maybe it's on the French bash.
Yeah, maybe they're very professional and and brave. And
I love France. I love France.
Okay, right. But they're, yeah, no,
the state of most NATO militaries is very weak.
Right. And actually, and all of them have just sent a lot of their, like half of their weapons to Ukraine already. So they were pretty weak to begin with, but they're even weaker. I mean, it's just like the British forces are pathetic, if anything, worse than the French.
Mm-hmm. But can't even fill a football stadium,
right?
Armed forces.
Right. I think that's true of both of them. But maybe, he really is so vain. And, again, he's just thinking about his place in history and he's convinced himself, again, these people, they got themselves into this fix because they underestimated Russia and they overestimated, their own power, the value, the effectiveness of their equipment and so on and so forth. It is part of, this sort of this, exceptionalism. We talk about U.S. exceptionalism, but I think it extends to the Western Europe as well,
just by association,
right? And so anyway, I think they find it very hard to believe that they can't defeat Russia. Mm. And maybe if these politicians, that's just part of who they are. It's just like we're the greatest people on earth. We are. We always talk about the international community, which is really just basically Western Europe and the United States and a few, far-flung allies. And they're the people that matter. Again, they're no matter what, they just seem to think that they are there at the, at the pinnacle, and how dare anybody try to oppose them. So maybe, I think some of them are waking up and realize, okay, well, yeah, this hasn't worked out very well, but a lot of them in general just have trouble dealing with that. And maybe Macron in particular, and they just say, okay, well, enough of this. It's our problem. Our only problem is, not that in fact we're weak or, we overestimate our own strengths, but it's just been a lack of commitment, And so we just need to go in there and, not respect their red lines and to hell with it. We've got to teach them a lesson. Mm. And he's probably knows enough to understand that the French themselves aren't going to turn the tide. But he thinks that he'll, that by taking that first step, others will follow, and then it'll be, all of NATO against Russia. Maybe,
Right.
or maybe he's just playing saying stuff, spouting stuff, and he's not doesn't really have any intention.
They called it strategic ambiguity.
Yeah,
right? Just spout all kinds of nonsense.
Right.
Like, what the hell is he going on about? And
Yeah.
that's somehow a great strategy.
Yeah, maybe that's all it is. I mean, maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's all talk. I certainly hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like I agree that it's probably unlikely, but I'm going to put you at 80%. Not going to happen. 20%
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah, I actually probably more or less agree with you on that. That's about what I would say.
Okay, I mean, that's actually pretty big. We think 20% chance that actually,
that's very scary, right?
Right, because then we're talking of then you can quickly draw the lines, the escalation ladder to a full-on, World War III.
Right.
With
the potential
of nuclear weapons.
Right. No, it's a very scary situation. I don't think it will happen, but we're coming awfully close to it. Much closer than we've been to since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's fun.
Yeah,
that's great. And now, do we feel like that the situation in the Middle East is just as volatile? 20% chance of war with Iran, which also,
well, I think as we said before, I think. Actually, it just seems like you can see an off ramp, like we've said, in Europe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just don't see the off ramp in the Middle East. The only thing you can say is just that the players. I mean, we're not talking about.
We're not talking about U.S. versus Russia.
We're
talking about proxies. We're talking about Iran and Israel.
Right.
Which Russia backs Iran, and U.S. backs Israel.
So there's a remove. There's a little bit of distance,
but there's a possibility.
Yeah. Right. So it could be. I mean, it could be a regional war, which could be terrible, and then could end up in some kind of nuclear conflagration again because of the Samson option in Israel, and so it is very, very scary, but. At least initially, I think it would just be a regional war. Whereas if it blows up in Ukraine, it becomes World War III right away.
Right. Okay, so both pretty bad situations.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we can reach some type of off ramp and cooler heads prevail, and we can negotiate peace in Ukraine. It looks like you said, we got these blooms happening, the lines broken through. It is coming to the end game. So any decisions that are going to be made will be probably made within the next couple of months. Otherwise, we're looking at a complete capitulation in Kiev is what we're looking at, right? Either the regime is going to have to completely surrender. How does it end? Can you help me explain?
I don't see I don't know. They may not surrender, but they'll move. We don't know if Russia's going to go for Kiev.
I still have that idea that
they might.
Ukraine's going to turn on the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. That's not all kinds of things. I'm just they could surrender. They eventually could flip, but there would have to be some sort of a political coup within.
Right.
Military coup, within Ukraine. Right. A lot of things would have to happen before that. And then remember, these nationalists are still very powerful. And for them, what defines them is their hatred of Russia.
So but aren't most of them dead now?
Well, that's true. And again, Zaluzhny was a supporter of these extreme nationalists. And they did disband one of them. I think it was the 3rd Assault Brigade. Was it that one or one? They've already disbanded one of them, or maybe it was the right sector. It was one or another. So they're weakened. It may be that if they don't strike back soon, they may fall out of power, and they still have influence, but they've been weakened by the fighting, but not as much as other brigades because Zaluzhny protected them. That's part of it. They were coddled. Like he kept them in reserve and sort of kept them there to put out fires and maybe discipline, kind of enforce discipline in the frontline units. And that's maybe one of the reasons why they've refused to, they were used to being in the rear and not taking the brunt of, Russian attacks. And then when Syrskyi tried to send them first off to Yevka, that's, they simply refused. And then later to Chasiv Yar.
Yeah.
refused again, because they saw, this is crazy, well, most of us are going to die, but
So
and
then
they've
there was
had a
just
kind of a privilege, they've had the sense of privilege, and they exercise it. They refuse to go. But yeah, maybe their days are
well,
numbered.
when you say they're disbanded, does that mean they get absorbed into other battalions, other groups?
I imagine so. I don't
Uh,
think they're going to just let them wander off.
yeah,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we can probably stop here soon, unless there's anything else you want to go over. Any big
Well,
news that came out,
yeah, not so much news.
or
There
just
was, there were,
any thoughts, speculations on
right.
these developments?
Yeah. Well, maybe we could talk about it next time, but there was a very interesting study that came from out of a British think tank that, that it, that actually, so it entirely validated the Russian approach to this war, and it was really an alarm. He was ringing the alarm bells, for the Western militaries. He said, you've been training for the wrong war. And what he does is he says there are two kinds of warfare. One is, there are wars of attrition, and then there are wars of maneuver. And Western armies all of them are trained and equipped to fight wars of maneuver. These are fast wars that are concluded, like in a short period of time, within a month or a couple of months. And frankly, if you're up against a weaker opponent like Iraq, you can fight a war of maneuver. You strike suddenly, deep into the enemy's rear
And roll
yeah,
in, right?
Right. But when you're fighting a near peer adversary, the likely outcome is a war of attrition, and that's what we've seen in.
And a war of attrition means you need to have industrial capacity.
Right. A big part of it is an industrial capacity, but it's also the kind of weapons and officers that you have. See, what the Western armies have is, some very sophisticated equipment. Not all of it's so great as it's made out to be, but some of it is quite good if you have, highly trained officers, highly trained troops, and you've got a short war. They may be good for like those first few volleys, but in a long slog, in a war of attrition over the course of months, you run into a lot of problems. I mean, these, first of all, these weapons, because they're so complicated, are hard to produce. So you can't replace them as they're used up. You just, whereas,
also maintenance probably.
And maintenance is another big part of it. Just to give one example, the Abrams tank requires 8 hours of maintenance for every 1 hour of operation. So you just think about it. You operate that tank for 10 hours, and you need 80 hours of maintenance. And again, you have to have highly trained personnel to do this. Now, and to operate the tank, you have to have highly trained personnel. So, if it's a quick war, you maybe can overwhelm the enemy in your with your quick, fast maneuvers, your blitzkrieg tactics, in the first days of a war, and you don't have to really worry about these maintenance problems and replacing equipment, and then eventually replacing officers. Because the thing is, like, these officers, to operate this equipment, they have to be very highly trained. They require long periods of training. We're finding out that like the F-16, you really need years of training to really fly an F-16 properly. That's just one example. But in a war of attrition, you start to lose your officers, and you just don't. And the replacements cannot have. You don't have years to train the replacement.
Right.
Now on the Soviet side, or I should say the Russian side, but it was true of the Soviets too. You have equipment that maybe like
on a one-on-one quick fight.
Yeah, right. Where they've got their equipment fine-tuned. They got the guy, this team that's been training with the equipment for 5 years and whatever. Maybe the West has an edge. Maybe not, but let's say, let's just grant them, let's say they have an edge. But then over time, because you've got enough resources, they don't achieve that quick victory. You find yourself in a war of attrition with a more like static front. They just keep on pounding away. You start losing these people. You lose the equipment. The maintenance times become longer and longer. So you can't replace the equipment. And then, but over on the Russian side, when somebody you lose some officers, some highly skilled troops, that were operating your tanks, for example. Well, because their tanks aren't as hard to operate, you can bring in it. First of all, they're pumping out tanks at a faster rate, and then you have, you know, maybe
less training.
Yeah, maybe just 6 months or whatever, and they can operate it just fine. And so, in the long run, they've got you beat. Right. It's sort of like a sprinter against a marathon runner, and when a war of attrition is a marathon, and so that's what you're seeing.
Right,
and that's what's happening on the front in Ukraine. And say that in a war, another thing about it is that, okay, in a war of maneuver, you want to seize territory. That's the idea. Okay, in a war of attrition, there's no point in doing that. You just want to, it's force centric rather than terrain centric. You want to destroy the forces of the opposition, just grind them down. And so you don't want to have, these big aerial offensives. You want to actually, be very cautious. You have well fortified positions and you keep them, but you just keep on pounding at the enemy. And you want the enemy to not understand, but, to attempt the war of maneuver, which is exactly what happened last year, the so-called big counteroffensive, of 2023.
Right.
They were supposed to use the Western tactics, and it was a disaster. So because they got out there, and it was just, it's like a turkey shoot for the Russians all summer long, because they got out of their trenches and got into the minefields, and they were just pulverized again and again and again, so at the end of that, they lost who knows how many tens of thousands of men, how much equipment,
depleted everything they had.
And the lines didn't move at all. And the Russians stayed there. And now we can see that it looks like we're entering into the next phase. Now, this is something to do with actually the technology. Again, it's actually very hard to conduct offense because, again, the ability to survey everything, we've got satellites and we've got drones, and so you can't achieve the surprise.
See accumulation of troops and munitions, right?
But then also, there are these drones, especially these FPV drones, right? First-person view drones. They're very effective, and that's one thing the Ukrainians still have a lot of. The Russians have even more. Earlier in the fight, I think the Ukrainians actually had an advantage in this. They lost it since then, but they still have a lot of them. So the thing is, like, once you get out in the open, those drones start finding you and, coming down, swooping out, right? You can hit tanks and individual soldiers. And it's, so it's very, very costly to conduct any kind of
damn terrifying.
Yeah, really, you think about it. So people, the soldiers want to stay in their trenches. But what, in the trenches, you have the trenches, but also you have this electronic bubble. There are various electronic warfare units, stations that are established to provide this protective bubble. And also you have counter artillery and whatever. And when you're stationary, you can actually provide your men a lot of protection, right? And they just breaking it down on the other side, which is what the Russians have been doing. But I guess they've broken it down enough that they can start to move. Now, moving is very, very complex because you got to move your protective bubble with you as you go forward. It's not just simple like this.
This bubble, it disables drones, is what it is?
Yeah, as part of it, they can disable drones, but also communications and GPS systems. And this is something an area where the Russians are very, very strong. And actually recently, there have been a lot of articles in the Western press discussing this. They've admitted that a lot of their, the missiles that they supplied for example, the ground launch small diameter bombs. That came out, it was big fanfare. They had specially developed this for Ukraine. They're supplying it by the Ukrainians who was going to counter the fab bombs that Russia was using against Ukraine with such devastating effect. But it was a total bust. The Russians very quickly figured out how to disable them with their electronic warfare. And so it went from having 70% hit rate down to 9% or lower.
Wow.
It was so anyway, but yeah, to advance, it's still very hard to advance because you want to advance with your protective bubble because no matter what, again, there are those drones out there always ready to swoop down from you, out of the sky.
How fast are these drones?
They're not particularly fast. I don't, 100 miles an hour or something. Maybe
pretty fast.
Yeah, maybe not even that. I actually don't know the answer.
Yeah, I saw.
There were different kinds of drones. Actually, the Russians are developing drones with jet engines.
Oh,
So
good.
some of them could be quite fast, but not these first-person view drones, the FPV drones.
Right,
I think
because
they're
yeah,
just
I
slow.
saw a Russian soldier talking about sort of their standard kit when they go out in the field, and they have some type of scrambler for the drones,
Right.
and then they're also armed with a shotgun to shoot down the drone, just an
Yeah.
old fashioned 12
Right.
gauge, I guess, which makes sense. It's like a bird,
Yeah.
flying around,
Right.
and so just you better hope you don't miss, because if you miss, then it's going to blow
Right.
you
No, I've
up.
seen some videos actually, like one of a Russian soldiers dodging drones that were dive bombing him and just diving out of the way at the last second.
Oh God,
And yeah, he survived, but boy, that would be terrifying. What a frightening
yeah,
experience.
I've seen
Yeah.
also like last second footage, people like just begging to a drone before it hit. It's awful.
Yeah, no,
It's
it is
scary.
really, yeah, you think so. This is the reason that why the line has moved so slowly. Now it's moving faster, and what you do in this again is like we're saying, you don't just concentrate all your forces in one place. You make shallow advances, okay? Because you on a kind of a tactical local level, you can. It's very hard to coordinate all this different kind of equipment that is necessary to maintain this protective bubble. Right. But it can't, it's a great challenge, but it can be done at a local level. Kind of like, okay, maybe a company or something,
Right.
or maybe even smaller than a couple of platoons or something moving forward. Okay, you can, as they move forward, the protective bubble goes with them.
Right. I'm imagining a lot of really long extension cords, but I'm sure it's much more complicated in advance than
Right.
that.
Yeah, no, it's very complicated. So the advances have to be local and kind of shallow. And so, but, as it goes on over the whole line, I think the tendency will be for it to accelerate as they begin to, again, break through. We have these blooms, and the Ukrainians who are depending on these well-constructed fortifications, they find themselves, they're driven out of those or find themselves surrounded or outflanked, and it turns into a different kind of war. And that seems to be what's happening now. We're entering into the second phase.
Okay. Well, interesting. We'll see. There's a lot of military strategy stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating.
So,
I mean, it's just like you think, well, why don't they move or whatever? But yeah, you get out there and you understand why. It's just, This is a new kind of war.
Well, you also have to, first that, just the amount of sort of infrastructure required for this war is much different than we've seen in the past. Everybody likes to go back to World War II, World War I. We've got to realize that was it's 80, 70 years ago.
Right. Well, there are similarities to World War I.
Trench warfare.
Right. But it's even...
But I think the big thing that you mentioned that I think people understand is that the West did not prepare for any scalability. They're not able to scale. And if you have anybody that runs a company or anything like that, you recognize that this is a big problem.
Yeah.
Once you get more users or whatever, scaling up is key. We have too many bottlenecks.
Right. Well, the West has been preparing for the wrong kind of war.
Right.
Again, it's just
because they can't scale up because
right
because they have too many bottlenecks.
Yeah. And I remember actually years and years ago translating. It was some sort of military analysis. And it said, outright that wars of the future are going to be like decided within a month. I mean, and I think that's basically what the West has been assuming. They said recently, for example, there were war games done in Taiwan and the surrounding area, but the war game didn't go past a month. Nobody stopped to think about, well, what happens after the month if it's not decided?
Yeah.
And so everything, it's just not, it's the training, it's the equipment, it's just the thinking, and this is also deeply institutionalized that it's very hard to need really a revolution in the system. That's just not happening.
Right. The system is built for this function and it's irrelevant. It seems like this is what happens. Everybody is basing their military based on the last big war. And so they think about it that way.
You always fight the last war.
You always fight the last
war.
Right. You saw, the biggest obvious one is between World War I and World War II, right? World War I, trench warfare, very bloody war. Millions of people die for just inches of land being moved one way or the other. Nothing really happening. And then we had World War II, and the French were like, we're all ready for this.
Yeah,
we know what happened.
Maginot Line.
Right. We're going to build the best damn trench ever, the Maginot Line.
Right.
Germany just busted through it in a week, the whole thing in several spots, and then just went blasted right through, and they prepared
Right.
for the wrong war.
Yeah, using blitzkrieg. Right.
Losing blitzkrieg, and then maybe we're kind of building off of that blitzkrieg in all of our sort of little escapades in the Middle East and around the
Right.
world, where we can do these type of maneuvers,
Right.
these open space maneuvers, blitzkrieg type tactics, where
Right.
we just zip around in our fast tanks and bomb real quick, and we weren't prepared for what we have here, which was, we have strong fortifications, more of a World
Right.
War One type line, like you said, where the line is set, war of attrition, and we're just throwing our equipment willy nilly, and it's blowing up, and we don't have the ability to produce because
Right.
we prepared for the wrong war.
Right. And, apparently,
and we can't change. That's the thing, is because it's so big and just obtuse now. You can't
So many people are invested in the old way of doing things, both monetarily. Yeah, it isn't changing. Apparently there's some, for example, American mercenaries in Ukraine. They go back and they find that that they've got friends who are in the U.S. military, and those friends are questioning, like, what's happening over there? What do you do? How do you deal with these situations? And they got to tell them, say, yeah, we're not getting any training for this. We're training for some other war entirely.
Oh, Lord. Oh, man. Okay, well, Dad, it's already past an hour, so I think we should wrap it up now. But it's a little something different, kind of the military strategy, interesting. So hope everybody found it interesting. Okay, thanks a lot, Dad.